I'll never love you.
Blood, cold, and blue, supposedly ran through the veins of Dominic Mercer, the formidable Duke of Alderley. When he stood at the altar beside Diana Street, James, a woman sold to him for £80,000 to settle her father's catastrophic gambling debts, he whispered a vow that had nothing to do with holy matrimony. "I will provide for you, protect you, and give you my title," he murmured, his gaze fixed straight ahead on the gilded cross of the abbey. "But I will never love you." He meant every icy syllable. Yet, history is paved with the shattered pride of arrogant men, and Dominic would soon destroy his entire empire, his pristine reputation, and his very soul, just to hear her say those 3 words back to him. The year was 1788, and the London season was a ruthless marketplace, disguised beneath silk gowns and polite waltzes. At the center of this gilded slaughterhouse stood Lord Ryder Street, James, the Earl of Kennington. Lord Ryder was a man who possessed an exquisite eye for thoroughbred horses and an abysmal lack of luck at the card tables of whites. By the time the first frost hit the city streets, the Earl was facing total financial ruin. His estates were mortgaged to the hilt, his creditors were circling like starving wolves, and debtor's prison loomed as a very real, horrifying prospect. He possessed only one remaining asset of any tangible value: his eldest daughter, Lady Diana, St. James. Diana was not merely beautiful. She possessed a striking, quiet dignity that made the frivolous debutantes of her era look like chattering birds. She had hair the color of roasted chestnuts and eyes that held the storm-gray depths of the English Channel. She was educated, fiercely intelligent, and utterly resigned to the reality of her world. When her father called her into his study, his hands trembling as he poured a glass of cheap brandy, she did not weep when he told her she was to be married to Dominic Mercer. She merely asked what the bride price was, and if it would be enough to secure her younger sister's futures. Dominic Mercer, the Duke of Alderley, was 32 years old and famously referred to by society as the Iron Duke, a moniker earned long before Arthur Wellesley would claim it, born entirely of his personality. Dominic was a man carved from marble and duty. 7 years prior, he had been foolish enough to fall in love. He had offered his heart to Lady Caroline Beaufort, only for her to elope with a penniless French violinist 3 days before their wedding, taking a substantial amount of the Mercer family jewels with her. The scandal had nearly broken the Alderley name. Dominic had ruthlessly crushed the rumors, hunted down the jewels, and permanently excised the capacity for romantic affection from his chest. He required a duchess. He needed an heir to secure his vast, sprawling lineage, and he needed a woman who would not demand the one thing he refused to give: his heart. Lady Diana, impoverished and desperate, was the perfect candidate. She would be grateful, she would be compliant, and above all, she would be manageable. The marriage contract was drawn up with the clinical precision of a military treaty. £80,000 exchanged hands, debts were erased. And on a bitterly cold Tuesday in November, Diana stood shivering in a gown of white velvet, binding herself to a man whose eyes held all the warmth of a frozen lake. Their carriage ride from London to the ancestral Mercer estate, Highwood Hall in Gloucestershire, took 3 agonizing days. Inside the velvet-lined carriage, the silence was suffocating. Dominic read his parliamentary papers, not bothering to make idle conversation. Diana looked out the window, watching her freedom dissolve into the passing, frost-bitten countryside. When they finally arrived at Highwood Hall, a massive, imposing fortress of grey stone that looked more like a prison than a home, Dominic finally addressed her. He stood in the grand foyer, dismissing the army of servants with a flick of his wrist until they were entirely alone under the soaring, vaulted ceiling. The candlelight flickered across his sharp jawline. "Let us be entirely clear about our arrangement, madam," Dominic said, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "You are now the Duchess of Alderley. You will want for nothing. Your gowns will be from Paris, your jewels will rival the Queen's, and your sisters will be sponsored by my name when they come of age. In return, I expect decorum. I expect an heir. And I expect you to remember the vow I made to you at the altar." Diana stood tall, her spine rigid despite the exhausting journey. "That you will never love me." "Precisely," Dominic replied, stepping closer. His imposing height meant to intimidate. "Do not seek romance from me, Diana. Do not look for warmth. I am a man of duty, and this marriage is a transaction. We will share a bed only when necessary to secure the succession. Otherwise, you will have the East Wing entirely to yourself. I will not interfere with your days, and you will not interfere with mine. Are we understood?" Most women of her age would have dissolved into tears. They would have pleaded, or thrown a tantrum, or locked themselves away in despair. Diana looked up into his cold, calculating eyes, and a small, almost dangerous smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Perfectly understood. Your Grace. It is a relief, truly." Dominic's brow furrowed slightly. "A relief?" "Indeed," Diana replied, her voice smooth as glass. "It takes a tremendous amount of energy to feign affection for a man one finds completely insufferable. Knowing I am not required to pretend makes this arrangement entirely palatable. Good night, husband." She turned and walked up the grand staircase, leaving the Duke of Alderley staring after her, experiencing a completely unfamiliar sensation. He had been dismissed. Dominic expected his new wife to retreat into the shadows. He assumed she would spend her days writing melancholic letters to her friends, spending his money on frivolous trinkets, and quietly fading into the background of Highwood Hall, much like the faded tapestries lining the corridors. He left for London a week after their wedding, citing urgent parliamentary business in the House of Lords. In truth, he was retreating. He consummated the marriage on their third night with a mechanical, detached efficiency that left Diana staring at the canopy of the bed, feeling more hollow than she had ever felt in her life. He had touched her with undeniable skill, but with the chilling detachment of a man performing a necessary chore. When he left for London, he expected her to be broken. Instead, Diana went to work. If she was to be the Duchess of Alderley, she would rule her domain. The morning after Dominic's carriage departed, Diana summoned the estate manager, a stern, aging man named Mr. Harrison, and the intimidating housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. "The Duke has given me authority over the domestic affairs of Highwood Hall," Diana announced, sitting behind the massive oak desk in Dominic's private study, a room no woman had entered in a decade. "And frankly, Mr. Harrison, the estate is running at a shocking level of inefficiency." Over the next 4 months, Diana tore through Highwood Hall like a beautifully dressed hurricane. She discovered that Dominic, in his emotional detachment, had completely neglected the human element of his lands. Tenant farmers were struggling under archaic taxation rules. The servant quarters were freezing and damp. The local village school had lost its funding. Using the vast allowance Dominic had provided for her personal amusements, Diana began to rebuild. She repaired the tenant cottages. She hired a new physician for the village of Alderley on the Moor. She ordered coal to be distributed freely to the elderly during the harsh winter months. She fired the corrupt gamekeeper who had been abusing the local boys. And she promoted a young, forward-thinking understeward to modernize the crop rotations. Within months, the atmosphere of Highwood Hall transformed. The oppressive gloom lifted. The servants, who had initially viewed her with suspicion, grew fiercely loyal to their young duchess. Fireplaces roared, fresh flowers filled the drawing rooms, and laughter, actual laughter, was heard in the kitchens. When Dominic returned unannounced in early April, expecting to find the gloomy, silent mausoleum he had left behind, he walked into an estate he barely recognized. He arrived late in the afternoon. The massive front doors were thrown open, and instead of the usual fearful silence, he heard the sound of a string quartet echoing from the solarium. He strode through the halls, his heavy riding boots clicking against the marble. He found Diana in the conservatory. She was not crying. She was not pining. She was kneeling in the dirt, her expensive muslin gown slightly soiled at the hem, laughing freely as she helped the head gardener repot a rare orchid. The sun caught the chestnut highlights in her hair, and for a fraction of a second, Dominic's breath hitched in his chest. It was an involuntary, infuriating reaction. "I see my absence has not driven you to despair, madam," Dominic said, his deep voice cutting through the warm air. Diana looked up, startled, but quickly regained her composure. She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands, and offered him a flawless, polite curtsy. "Your Grace, welcome home." "I trust London was adequately miserable?" Dominic narrowed his eyes. London was productive. Highwood, however, appears to have undergone a rebellion. "My estate manager tells me you have halved the tenant rents and doubled the staff's coal allowance. You are spending my money with reckless abandon." "I am investing your money, Dominic," she corrected, stepping out of the dirt and meeting his gaze evenly. "Your tenants were starving. Starving men cannot harvest wheat. Your servants were freezing. Sick maids cannot clean your massive, drafty house. I have increased your estate's projected yield for the autumn by 20%, simply by treating your people like human beings." He stepped closer, towering over her. He expected her to back down, to cower as other men and women did when the Iron Duke exerted his presence. Diana did not flinch. She tilted her chin up, her gray eyes flashing with defiance. "I gave you an allowance for gowns and jewels, Diana," he murmured, his voice dangerously low. "And I found that securing the loyalty of your people was a much more attractive accessory than a sapphire necklace," she countered smoothly. "Dinner is at 8. I have had the chef prepare venison. Do try not to be late. I detest waiting." She walked past him, smelling of jasmine and damp earth, leaving Dominic utterly bewildered. He had wanted a ghost for a wife. He had bought a queen. Over the next month, a silent, psychological war waged between them. Dominic, stubbornly clinging to his vow of detachment, tried to assert his dominance. He was overly critical of her decisions. She defended them with flawless logic. He brought up his political triumphs at dinner to make her feel small. She engaged him in complex debates about trade tariffs that proved she read his parliamentary reports. He was infuriated by her. He was captivated by her. He found himself looking for her in the vast house. He found himself standing outside the library door, just listening to her read aloud to her younger sisters, who were visiting for the spring. He noticed the delicate curve of her neck when she painted in the garden. He noticed that she never, not once, asked for his affection. She lived entirely independent of his emotional validation, and to a man who was used to the world revolving around his approval, it was maddening. The ice around his heart was not melting. It was being systematically shattered by a woman who refused to even acknowledge it was there. The tipping point arrived in June, during the annual Midsummer Ball hosted by Lord and Lady Carlisle at their neighboring estate. It was the premier social event of the county, and Dominic's first public appearance with his new Duchess. The ballroom was a sea of glittering chandeliers, powdered wigs, and vicious gossip. Every eye in the county was fixed on the Duke and Duchess of Alderley. Society knew of Lord Ryder St. James's ruin. They knew Diana had been bought. They were waiting like vultures to see the cracks in the hastily arranged marriage. Diana was a vision. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that perfectly matched the famous Mercer sapphires draped around her neck, the very jewels Dominic had fought so hard to recover years ago. She held herself with the regal poise of a monarch, navigating the treacherous waters of societal small talk with effortless grace. Dominic watched her from across the room, a glass of brandy in his hand, feeling a strange, tight sensation in his chest. It was possessiveness. It was pride. It was a terrifying feeling he immediately tried to drown with the liquor. Then, Lady Arabella Fitzroy entered the ballroom. Arabella was a wealthy, spiteful widow who had spent the last 3 years trying to maneuver Dominic into her bed and ultimately to the altar. She viewed Diana's ascension to Duchess as a personal insult. Arabella was beautiful, cruel, and armed with a tongue like a razor blade. Halfway through the evening, Arabella cornered Diana near the open terrace doors. A small crowd of eager gossips naturally drifted closer, sensing blood in the water. Dominic, noticing the shift in the room's energy, began to move through the crowd, his jaw clenched. "My dear Duchess," Arabella purred loudly, ensuring her voice carried over the string orchestra. "How delightful to see you adapting to your new station. Though I must confess I was surprised when His Grace chose you. We all knew of your father's unfortunate circumstances. Tell me, how does it feel to be the most expensive wager Lord Ryder ever lost?" A collective gasp rippled through the bystanders. It was a brutal, unforgivable insult designed to publicly humiliate Diana and remind everyone of her purchased status. Diana went perfectly still. The color drained from her face, but she kept her chin high. She opened her mouth to deliver a measured response, but before she could speak, a massive, imposing figure stepped up tightly beside her. "Lady Arabella," Dominic's voice rang out. It was not loud, but it possessed a lethal coldness that instantly silenced the surrounding crowd. Arabella's smug smile faltered. "Your Grace, we were merely—" "I heard exactly what you were doing," Dominic interrupted, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying fury. He reached out and placed his hand firmly on the small of Diana's back, a public gesture of absolute solidarity. "Let me correct your catastrophic ignorance. Lord Ryder did not lose a wager. I made an investment. I scoured this country for a woman possessing the intellect, the grace, and the strength to bear the Mercer name. I found exactly one." He took a step closer to Arabella, who actually shrank back in fear. "My wife," Dominic continued, his voice dripping with venom, "is the greatest asset this family has acquired in a century. If I ever hear you speak of her, her father, or her family with anything less than the utmost reverence, I will personally ensure that every door in polite society is permanently closed to you. You will find yourself a social pariah before breakfast. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Arabella was trembling, her face flushed dark red with humiliation. "Yes, Your Grace," she whispered. "Excellent. Now, remove yourself from my sight." Arabella fled the ballroom. The surrounding crowd immediately pretended to be deeply engrossed in other conversations. Dominic looked down at Diana. Her eyes were wide, staring at him in sheer astonishment. He had defended her. The man who had vowed never to care had just threatened a powerful socialite on her behalf. "Come with me," he muttered gruffly, his hand dropping from her back as if he had been burned. He led her out of the suffocating ballroom, through the dimly lit corridors of the Carlisle estate, and out onto a secluded stone balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens. The summer air was thick and fragrant with roses. They stood in silence for a long moment. Dominic gripped the stone balustrade, his knuckles turning white, his chest heaving as he fought a terrifying internal battle. He was losing control. The carefully constructed fortress he had built around his heart was crumbling, and he was terrified. "You did not have to do that," Diana said softly, stepping up beside him. "I could have handled her." "I am aware," Dominic said, staring out into the darkness. "But you are my wife. No one disrespects what is mine." "Is that all I am to you, Dominic?" Diana asked, turning to face him. The moonlight caught the vulnerability she usually kept so well hidden. A possession to be guarded, an asset to be defended. Dominic turned to her. In the pale light, she looked ethereal. He saw the slight tremble of her lower lip, the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the sheer, undeniable reality of her. He didn't want her to be just an asset. God help him. He wanted her to be everything. The restraint snapped. With a low, desperate sound, Dominic closed the distance between them. His hands framed her face, tangling in her chestnut hair, and he kissed her. It was not the cold, mechanical touch of their wedding night. It was a kiss born of fire and desperation, hungry and punishing and deeply, agonizingly real. For a moment, Diana froze in shock. Then, with a soft gasp, she surrendered. Her hands came up to grip the lapels of his velvet evening coat, pulling him closer. She opened her mouth to him, matching his desperate fervor, pouring months of silent longing and unspoken frustration into the kiss. It was electric. It was everything Dominic had sworn he would never allow himself to feel again, and that realization was like a bucket of ice water over his head. Lady Caroline, the betrayal, the laughter of the ton, the absolute, crushing agony of a broken heart. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Dominic's chest. He tore himself away from her so violently, he nearly stumbled. He backed away, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of lust and absolute terror. Diana stood there, her lips swollen, her eyes bright, breathing heavily. She reached a hand out toward him. "Dominic?" "No," he gasped, throwing a hand up to stop her. He had to rebuild the wall. He had to sever this before it destroyed him again. He reached for the cruelest weapon he possessed, his pride. He straightened his coat, forcing his face into a mask of pure aristocratic indifference. "I apologize, madam. That was entirely inappropriate." Diana's hand dropped. The warmth in her eyes died instantly, replaced by confusion. And then, a dawning, horrific hurt. "Inappropriate?" "Indeed," Dominic said, his voice laced with forced ice. He looked at her, actively forcing himself to ignore the pain radiating from her expression. "Do not mistake a moment of weak, physical lust for affection, Diana. You looked beautiful." The wine went to my head, and I momentarily forgot myself. "It will not happen again. Our arrangement remains exactly as it was." The silence that followed was louder than a cannon blast. Diana stared at him. She saw the terror in his eyes, but she also saw the cruelty of a man choosing his pride over her heart. She slowly stood taller, her spine locking into place, the iron returning to her soul. She had given him a glimpse of her vulnerability, and he had trampled it. She would never, ever make that mistake again. "I understand, Your Grace," Diana said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. It was dead. "I assure you, I would never be so foolish as to mistake anything you do for love." She turned and walked back into the ballroom, her head held high, leaving Dominic alone on the balcony. He stood there for a very long time, the taste of her still on his lips. He had won the skirmish. He had protected his heart. He had maintained his vow. But as he looked out into the empty, cold night, Dominic Mercer realized with sickening clarity that he had just made the greatest mistake of his life. He hadn't just protected his heart, he had just guaranteed that Diana would lock hers away from him forever. And suddenly, the prospect of a lifetime without her love felt exactly like a death sentence. The morning after the midsummer ball, Diana St. James fundamentally changed. When Dominic descended to the breakfast room, quietly prepared to offer a stiff, carefully worded apology for his harshness, he found her already seated. Her posture was immaculate, her tea was poured, and her expression was serene. But when she looked at him, Dominic felt a chill settle deep in his marrow. Her eyes, once a stormy, expressive gray, were entirely devoid of light. They were flat. "Opaque." She offered a polite inclination of her head. "Good morning, Your Grace." It was the voice of a stranger. In a single night, Diana had built a fortress around her heart so high and so thick that Dominic realized, with a sickening jolt, he might never be able to scale it. Over the next year, Diana became exactly what Dominic had originally asked for: the perfect, untouchable Duchess. When the London season began in the spring of 1789, she took the capital by storm. She hosted the most exclusive salons in Mayfair. She was brilliant, witty, and devastatingly beautiful. Men of immense power, from esteemed diplomats to the notorious Charles James Fox, flocked to her side, captivated by her sharp intellect and unshakable poise. She became known among the ton as the Ice Duchess. Quote, "She was adored by everyone, yet belonged to no one." End quote. Least of all to her husband, Dominic watched her triumph from the shadows of crowded ballrooms, consumed by a regret so profound it felt like a physical illness. He tried to bridge the chasm he had created. He purchased a breathtaking diamond parure from a fleeing French aristocrat and had it delivered to her chambers. Diana wore it to the opera the very next evening, thanked him with a flawless curtsy, and then looked through him as if he were made of glass. He offered to accompany her on morning rides through Hyde Park. She politely declined, stating she preferred the solitude. He was starving for her, and she was denying him the very air he needed to breathe. The irony was a bitter ash in his mouth. The man who had demanded a loveless marriage was now entirely undone by it. Then, in July of 1789, the world caught fire. The Bastille fell in Paris, sending shockwaves across the English Channel. London was thrown into a frenzy of political panic and financial instability, as French nobility fled to England, bringing with them desperate pleas and smuggled wealth. It was in this chaotic crucible that the ghosts of Diana's family returned to exact their toll. Late one evening in November, Dominic was summoned to 10 Downing Street for a private audience with the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger. Dominic and Pitt were close allies. Dominic's sharp political mind and vast wealth had been instrumental in securing the Prime Minister's majority in the House of Lords. But when Dominic entered the dimly lit office, Pitt did not offer a drink. He looked grave, his thin face drawn with exhaustion. "Alderley," Pitt said quietly, sliding a heavy, leather-bound ledger across the polished mahogany desk. "I intercepted this from a harbor master in Dover. I wanted you to see it before it reaches the desk of the Exchequer." Dominic opened the ledger. His blood ran cold. It was a meticulous record of smuggling, extortion, and illegal bond trading involving stolen French gold. And at the bottom of the most damning documents, authorizing the movement of funds that directly undermined the Crown's delicate foreign policy, was a signature Dominic knew all too well: Lord Ryder St. James, Diana's father. He has been acting as a broker for the most desperate of the French émigrés, taking exorbitant cuts and burying the gold in illegal offshore accounts, Pitt explained, his voice heavy. "It is fraud on an unprecedented scale. When this breaks, Alderley, it will be the scandal of the decade. Lord Ryder will face the gallows for treasonous financial manipulation, and all his properties will be seized by the Crown." Dominic stared at the signature. He didn't care about Lord Ryder. The Earl was a fool and a degenerate. But Diana. If her father hung for treason, Diana's name would be permanently destroyed. The polite society that currently worshipped her would turn on her with the viciousness of starving wolves. She would be the daughter of a traitor. Her sisters, whom she loved so fiercely, would be ruined, their prospects obliterated. The brilliant, proud life she had built from the ashes of her father's previous ruin would be burned to the ground. "Who else has seen this?" Dominic asked, his voice a low rasp. "Only my most trusted spies," Pitt replied. "But I cannot bury it, Dominic. The sum is too large. Nearly £200,000 is missing from the designated refugee tariffs. Someone must answer for the debt, and someone must face the political guillotine." Pitt looked at him sympathetically. "Divorce her, Dominic. Annul the marriage before the news breaks. Distance the Mercer name from the street. James' family, or you will be dragged down into the mud with them." It was the logical choice. It was the choice the Iron Duke of a year ago would have made, without a second thought. Protect the estate. Protect the title. Protect the pristine Mercer reputation at all costs. Dominic closed the ledger. He looked up at the Prime Minister, his jaw set in a line of absolute, unbreakable resolve. "The Duke of Alderley does not abandon his own, Prime Minister," Dominic said softly. "Dominic, be reasonable," Pitt warned, standing up. "If you do not sever ties, your political career is finished. The opposition will tear you apart. Let them." Dominic pulled his signet ring from his finger and placed it heavily on top of the ledger. "I will assume the debt. The £200,000 will be transferred to the Crown's treasury from my personal accounts by tomorrow morning. Furthermore, I will sign a confession stating that I authorized the bond transfers under a misguided attempt to aid the refugees, and that Lord Ryder was merely acting under my direct, unquestionable orders. Pitt stared at him in sheer disbelief. You are mad. You are talking about financial devastation. You will have to mortgage Highwood Hall. You will have to resign from the House of Lords. You will be a pariah. Draw up the papers, William, Dominic commanded, his voice echoing in the quiet room. I will sign them tonight. Dominic walked out of Downing Street, a ruined man. He had sacrificed the Mercer Empire, his political power, and his unblemished honor. And as he walked through the freezing London fog, stripped of everything that had once defined him, he felt a strange, profound sense of peace. He had finally found something worth bleeding for. The scandal broke 3 days later, and the destruction was absolute. Newspapers across London splashed the Duke of Alderley's treasonous greed across their front pages. Dominic resigned his seat in the House of Lords. He faced a humiliating public censure. To pay the astronomical debt to the Crown and keep Lord Ryder out of prison, Dominic was forced to liquidate his London properties, sell his prized racing stables, and mortgage the vast lands of Highwood Hall. The Ton was ruthless. The very people who had clamored for Dominic's favor a week prior now cut him dead in the street. Diana, however, was shielded from the brunt of the immediate chaos. Dominic had confined her to their remaining townhouse with strict orders to the staff that no newspapers or gossiping callers were to be admitted. He bore the public lashings alone, returning late each night, exhausted and smelling of cheap gin, the only comfort left to him, as his aristocratic world evaporated. But a secret of that magnitude could not be kept from a woman as sharp as the Duchess of Alderley. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Diana's estate manager, Mr. Harrison, arrived from Gloucestershire, looking pale and frantic. Bypassing Dominic's orders, he demanded to see the Duchess. When Diana received him in the drawing room, he laid out the catastrophic financial reports. Highwood Hall was mortgaged. The London townhouse was being sold. The Mercer fortune was effectively gone. Why? Diana whispered, staring at the foreclosure notices, her hands trembling. Why would my husband do this? He is the most prudent man in England. Mr. Harrison looked at the floor. Her Grace, it was your father. Lord Ryder was caught smuggling. The Duke, he took the blame. He paid the Crown to buy your father's life, and he took the political ruin upon himself, so that the St. James name would remain untainted. The room spun. The breath vanished from Diana's lungs. Dominic, the man of marble. Dominic, who valued his pride and his title above all living things. Dominic, who had sworn on a holy altar that he would never love her. He had systematically destroyed his entire universe just to keep her from crying. Diana didn't wait for the carriage. She threw a heavy wool cloak over her indoor gown and ran out into the pouring London rain. She ran through the muddy streets of Mayfair, ignoring the shocked stares of pedestrians, until she reached the doors of White's Club, where she knew Dominic had gone to finalize the sale of his final parliamentary assets. She burst through the heavy oak doors, a drenched, wild-eyed vision, ignoring the spluttering protests of the club stewards. She found him in a back parlor, sitting alone at a table, staring into a glass of amber liquid. He looked older. The arrogant sharpness of his jaw was shadowed with exhaustion, and the pristine perfection of his clothing was gone. He looked like a king who had lost his crown. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time in their marriage, he didn't try to hide his emotions. His eyes were wide, filled with a raw, agonizing vulnerability. "Diana," he rasped, standing up quickly. "You shouldn't be here. It isn't proper." Proper? Diana let out a breathless, broken laugh, slamming the heavy parlor door shut behind her and locking it. "You have bankrupted your estate, resigned your seat, and made yourself the most despised man in England. And you are worried about propriety?" She crossed the room, stopping inches from him. Water dripped from her chestnut hair onto the collar of his coat. "I know what you did," she said, her voice shaking violently. "Mr. Harrison told me. You took my father's treason You bought his life with your honor. Why, Dominic? Why would you do such a reckless, foolish, catastrophic thing? Dominic looked down at her. He didn't try to summon the Iron Duke. That man was dead. Because if he hung, you would be ruined, Dominic said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Society would have destroyed you. You would have been forced to hide your face, and your sisters would have suffered. I could not allow it. You swore an oath, Diana cried, slamming her hands against his chest. Tears, hot and fast, finally broke through the fortress she had built, mixing with the rain on her cheeks. You swore to me on our wedding day. You promised me you would never care. You told me on that balcony that I was nothing but a momentary lust, a possession. I lied, Dominic shouted, catching her wrists, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. The composure shattered completely. God forgive me, Diana, I lied. I was terrified. Caroline broke my pride. But you, from the moment you stood up to me in that cold hallway, from the moment you healed my people, from the moment you smiled at me, I knew you had the power to break my soul. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her wet hair, his massive frame shaking. I ruined myself because it was the only way to protect you, he whispered fiercely against her temple. I don't care about the title. I don't care about the money. I don't care if I am a pariah for the rest of my days. I love you, Diana. I have loved you in silence, in agony, and in absolute despair. I ruined myself trying to fight it, and I would do it 1,000 times over, just to hold you like this. Diana went still in his arms. The coldness, the bitterness, the ice of the past year melted in the brilliant, blinding heat of his confession. He was completely bare before her. He had laid his entire empire at her feet and set it ablaze to keep her warm. She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. She reached up, framing his tired, beautiful face with her hands, her thumbs brushing away a stray tear that escaped his lashes. You are a terrible duke, she whispered, a watery smile breaking across her face. The worst in history, he agreed, his breath hitching. And you are entirely bankrupt. Utterly. Good, Diana breathed, rising onto her toes. Because I never wanted a duke, Dominic. I only ever wanted you. She kissed him. And this time, there was no hesitation, no fear, and no retreat. It was a promise forged in the ashes of his ruin. They had lost the world, the approval of society, and the vast Mercer fortune. But as Dominic held his wife, tasting the rain and the salt of her tears, he knew he was the richest man in England. The story of the Duke and Duchess of Alderley remains one of history's most dramatic testaments to the destructive, redemptive power of love. Dominic Mercer sacrificed his entire empire and pristine reputation to protect the woman he had sworn never to care for, proving that true devotion often requires us to tear down the very walls we built to protect ourselves. Though they lived the rest of their lives away from the glittering, shallow ballrooms of London, their bond remained unbroken, a love forged in the fires of absolute ruin. If you were captivated by Dominic and Diana's journey from a cold transaction to a fiercely passionate romance, please hit the like button. Share this story with your fellow historical romance lovers, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more dramatic, heart-stopping tales of love, betrayal, and history's greatest untold secrets. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the Iron Duke's ultimate sacrifice.